Hi everyone, welcome to Sinocept. This is a YouTube channel where we try to intercept transmissions from China and Chinese-speaking media. I'm your host Parker, and today we're going to be looking at a Taiwanese news show that's called 年代向钱看. And it's I don't know, I would loosely translate that as like follow the money. It's kind of business, economics, finance, global politics, all those things wrapped up into one show. Um, so yeah, let's just get right into it. We have this host, Qian Ningguan, and she's kind of introducing us to some of the topics today. Apparently, Hu Jintao proposed 10 questions to Xi Jinping, and that's kind of caused some controversy. It's almost like uh, causing a little bit of internal political turmoil in the Chinese government. And she also is mentioning that they're going to talk about the Hong Kong protests and the economic and financial ramifications of some of the actions of those protesters. So, um, yeah, she starts off and she introduces her panel. And the thing I love about this show is that she lets her guests speak. She basically like brings up a topic and she lets them talk. And her first commentator is this gentleman by the name of Wu Mingjie. And I've seen him on the show before, and he seems to be like a specialist in military weapons, and he's often asked to be on the show to comment on like different arms deals between the U.S. and Taiwan, and then if there's ever any like military or naval activity in the South China Sea or anything like that that comments on weaponry and military strategy. He's very knowledgeable about it. He seems to be an expert in his field. He knows like all the different classes of weapons, and he knows like their history, all of their capacities, and he comes to the show well prepared. I don't know if he just like memorizes it, but he's just like well versed in all the different military capacities. So pretty much what they talk about one of the most important problems for China is how to deal with the Hong Kong protests. So in August 6th, and they show kind of footage of this, August 6th, they were basically revealing footage. The Chinese government was letting out footage where they were showing how they were practicing with their riot police. And I'll kind of scan to that here. Let's see what we got. Maybe it was early on. Yeah, right here. Okay, so it shows these like demonstrations from Chinese mainland riot police and the Liberation Army, and how they're preparing for those. And that was taken on August 6th, and they broadcast that out. And then August 10th is when they started showing these military grade vehicles. It's going to show that shortly after. They showed these kind of almost artillery looking tank like, basically like a, yeah, so all these different military vehicles coming in. And, he mentions that the Chinese government is really putting these videos out there to show that they are ready and prepared. However, it's also like not really an idle threat, that they're promoting these videos and they're showing them to the Hong Kong people and protesters and saying like, look, we're ready, we have these things on deck, and we're not afraid to bring in the infantry. So he says that these vehicles are now located in Shenzhen, and they're 10 minutes away from Hong Kong city center. And so you can see how things are escalating. He also talks about the different capacities with like the riot weaponry. So, for instance, he talks about the different bullets that are used, tear gas, and things like that. And he mentions that there was a girl, maybe she was 14 or I'm not sure, but she was injured by one of these bullets, and she lost eyesight in one of her eyes. And so he's mentioning that, the situation's gone so bad. Usually, when there's protests, there's a certain range that certain weapons are allowed to be used. And he's suggesting that, because the riot police and those forces, that they're kind of using these weapons um, improperly, so to speak. Like they're using them at close range when they should be used from far away. He's suggesting that they're kind of no longer under the control of Hong Kong government, that they might be heavily influenced by the Beijing government, and basically saying like fire at will. We know that you're supposed to be 100 yards away for tear gas, but just go for it. So yeah, he mentions like the beanbag bullets, which is what injured the girl's eye, and just talks about all the different capacities for that. He'd also mentioned that it was at close range, and those bullets aren't to be used at close range. They've been known to cause head trauma. If they're hit in the body somewhere, they've been known to cause internal bleeding and even death, which is why they have those restrictions. And so it's pretty unfortunate. Apparently, he describes it was shot from an elevated point, and because it was elevated going down at close range, and her protective gear had been knocked off, which led to that unfortunate incident. So yeah, that was pretty much the extent of his commentary. And then it goes to this gentleman, Wang Hao Dage, and he seems to be very knowledgeable about a lot of things. He's an international banking expert, and I've seen him featured on other shows as well. When he talks, people listen. He's very very knowledgeable about his area of expertise. So he basically starts out. He's saying that the HSI, the Hong Kong Stock Market Index, is down 15%. And then he also mentions that there's a call from the Hong Kong netizens and citizens to orchestrate a bank run for Hong Kong banks on August 15th and August 16th. So he mentions that, basically, if everybody does this at once, they have a connected banking system. So it's very easy to convert Hong Kong dollars into US dollars. And he says, it's pretty much like if everybody's going to do this, you might as well, because you're actually going from a weaker currency, 1 US dollar, to 7.8 Hong Kong dollars into a strong currency. And then if there's an economic effect from this, and if the Hong Kong currency devalues, within 3 months, you've got the US dollars, you can convert it back for a different exchange rate. So, like, let's say you convert your Hong Kong dollars and it's 7.8 to 1 US dollar. And then 3 months from now, you can use your US dollars to buy them back. For 1 US dollar, you can get 10 Hong Kong dollars or 12 Hong Kong dollars. He's saying, actually, it's a good form of protest, and that people should actually consider this for a little bit of financial gain. Once you do that, with that crisis, there's going to be a little bit of arbitrage opportunity there with the currency evaluation. So, yeah, so that's what he had to say. There's also this interlude video. It shows a top-level government official, and really he's laying on the rhetoric against the Hong Kong protesters. It was kind of scary, actually. I listened to it, and he portrays the protesters as increasingly violent and attacking the riot police. He also describes them as like domestic terrorists. He suggests like this is the beginning of some domestic terrorism, and he's calling on the Beijing government for action and to be merciless in combating the protesters. So it's kind of a very eerie speech that he was giving. I don't think that that's an accurate description of things. I think that largely these protests are peaceful. The protesters are very smart and organized, and a lot of these protesters are actually just like kids. And so the idea that they're like violent domestic terrorists is clearly just him trying to lay on the rhetoric and trying to paint them in a negative light. That would just be like my interpretation of that. So she turns it over to Yao Huizhen. Yao Huizhen. She's a very passionate woman. She's also a financial and economics expert, and she describes what's going on with the protests. And so she says that since the protests started in early June, over 600 protesters have been arrested, and the youngest being 13. She also mentioned that there was a pair of students that were going to get a textbook, and they were also arrested and assumed to be domestic terrorists. Parents went 4 hours without communicating with them. She said in the protests on August 11th, 54 people went to the hospital, the youngest being an 8-year-old boy. And so that's why I kind of describe the characteristic protester here in Hong Kong as actually like uh, young. Um, and so the idea that they're actually like resorting to violence or any kind of violence that would harm a group of riot police is kind of ridiculous. She mentions that they've raised $2 million. So for whatever funding vehicle that they've utilized, the protesters have a fund of $2 million, and that is to be used for advertising in the major G20 countries. And those advertisements will go out on August 17th and August 18th to raise awareness of the violent behavior of the Hong Kong riot police. They also plan another protest with over 3 million people to show the government how things are escalating to a point that is similar to the Tiananmen Square scenario and demand that they avoid such an occurrence. And then they also have an economic protest planned on August 16th, where they take all of their money out of the bank and even suggesting that they take people with like retirement money or retirement assets and remove it from Hong Kong asset classes. And they're doing all of these things. They want the government to know the resolve and the determination of the Hong Kong people. So as you can see, things are escalating to such a high degree. So many people are getting involved. It went from like a youth protest to now the entire city is protesting. And they're kind of waiting for more people to join in to support the cause, more people from Hong Kong to support the cause. But they want the government to know like that they mean what they say and that they're determined that their voices are heard and that changes be made. And they're doing that non-violently. You know, they're just kind of sitting in an airport shutting it down. They're doing it economically by suggesting a bank run on Hong Kong banks and things like that. Um, so yeah, they're very organized and they're very smart about the way that they protest. Okay, next one. This is Zhu Yuezhong. He's also a finance and economics expert. He was mentioning that the sentiment is bad. The Hong Kong sentiment towards Hong Kong is pretty negative. He says there's a significant number of people that believe the situation is irreversible, and there's a huge drop in the GDP expense ratio. So, household income versus GDP or household debt versus GDP. There's some kind of number there that he suggests is just not good. Um, and then the host also mentions that a lot of family has debt tied to the housing market. And so you've got like this conglomeration of all these different problems. He discusses how information is disseminated on social platforms. So I think he's got um, some of the things that he finds on social media that the Hong Kong protesters are using. And basically, let's see, they state all the clearly like the time and place for the protests, and then they also explain like the reasoning behind it. So he's just kind of talking about that kind of stuff. The host is like, man, this is all kind of new territory, so to speak. Like the idea that they're it's not just like a natural bank run, but that they're using it as a kind of protest. It's a bit of like a financial and economic experiment in that sense, and it's hard to determine what will happen. But obviously, the effects are supposedly going to be negative. So they talk about the bank run for a little bit. It goes back to Huang Hao Dage. Let's see. And he mentions a couple of things. They kind of have like a little back and forth. He mentions that there's no point in waiting in line at the bank because the bank doesn't have that much cash. So you might as well do it online or over the phone. And he says the problem is a lot of the reserves are tied up in treasury bonds, which they would have to sell if a huge volume of people want to convert Hong Kong dollars to US dollars. Okay, so it's like entering new territory and no one's really sure how it's going to unfold. It goes back to, let's see, this guy. Zhu Yuezhong. And this is a graph of people from Hong Kong that are immigrating to Taiwan, and it shows like a year over year comparison. You see a sharp increase there from 2015 to 2016 in the amount of people that have immigrated to Taiwan from Hong Kong. And the last one is particularly interesting because that only represents the first 5 months of 2019, and you can already see it's basically on par with last year and we're not even half of the year through with that data. So he's anticipating that those numbers are going to increase drastically. It's like, with the real estate prices being what they are in Hong Kong, you can essentially cash out and live a good life in Taiwan. And with all this turmoil and protesting, it appears that a lot of people are deciding to do that. Okay. All right. We also move on to Zhang Guocheng. He's also an expert in finance and economics. I believe he's a teacher as well, or professor. And he goes into a lot. Okay, so he mentions he's kind of like he adds a lot of different perspectives to that general conversation and a lot of things that maybe other commentators didn't consider. And so I really like hearing him out as well. He says that the planned bank run will only have an effect if middle class or wealthy people participate, which makes sense. It will prove they are willing to stick their necks out to support the protests. He says it might cause a credit crisis because once confidence is shaken, the vicious cycle begins. They also mentioned these 10 questions. Okay, so Hu Jintao proposes to Xi Jinping, and let's see, she's got like a list of them. Try to find it. There it is. Boom. All right. So this is the list of the 10 questions, right? And number one is like, what is to be done about Hong Kong and all that? And so there are like all these problems that are going on for the Chinese government. He says, these 10 questions, the most crucial ones are the last two, okay? And so question 9 is, if Western countries view Chinese foreign assets as illegal and investigate them, what will you do, or what will be done about that? And question number 10 is, are you able to maintain the current safety and security of our government structure and the rule of law? These are rough translations here. So those are the last two. And Zhang Guocheng believes that these are the two most important questions. It's like one of those political nuances where you try to communicate additional information through whatever the main thing is. So he's kind of looking through these and he's cutting to the chase with the most crucial ones. So he describes number 9, okay? He says what this actually means is that high-level officials in the Chinese government and their assets, their foreign assets, if they've chosen to have some capital outflows and they're keeping their wealth abroad, if that comes under investigation, you can't do anything, okay? And so essentially, like, what are you going to do about your money if it's in foreign hands? You can't, and if there's some complications with that, you can't say, hey, that's my money, or you can't go under litigation for that because that would be an admission of your own crime. Like, you would essentially be saying that, yeah, I have all this money that was not formally reported before, and that I'm hiding it in a foreign country. And so that's what he's saying that means. The other one is for number 10, your governance has proven, talking to Xi Jinping, so Xi Jinping's governance has proven to not solve all the problems. In fact, there's a whole host of problems that China is experiencing right now. He says, you've structured all of these small groups and committees, and anyone that says you're ineffective, you label them as corrupt. So the last one is kind of like, this is a statement maybe for like a political battle, and it's a cause for potentially some government turmoil, some political turmoil, government infighting within the Communist Party. So, yeah, so that's what that is. Yeah, and then they also talk about something that the initial cause of all of these protests, okay? It started as the China extradition bill. And so he mentions that the goal for this was actually for Xi Jinping to attack people in the government, high-level government officials that were holding their money in Hong Kong or other foreign places. And it was basically a way for him to get some leverage to try to reclaim those assets and to try those people if they were found guilty of corruption in Beijing as opposed to Hong Kong. And also, if they go under litigation, if they're in Hong Kong, they kind of have a chance to escape in a certain way. And so the extradition bill was to make sure that they stay in Beijing, that they can reclaim all of their assets, and that they can't hide from the Chinese government. And so basically what the fear is let's say you're a corrupt government official, you're hiding your assets in a Hong Kong bank, and you take a little trip to Hong Kong, and you kind of decide that you want to leave the country or you're going on trip somewhere. If you leave and then you're found to be corrupt and you're under trial and it's kind of like this whole controversy, you could then become an enemy of the political parties, the Communist Party in China. And so the idea is that, like, okay, if people are corrupt, if they get a chance to escape, then they will have an opportunity to attack me. And so I want to avoid that with the extradition bill. Okay. So yeah, and then there's a play on words. They kind of joke about it. The extradition bill is Song Zhong, going back to China, and that's also a homophone with Song Zhong, which means like to pay your respects, as if like somebody has passed. And so it's like, what's actually happening with this bill? Is it the end of Hong Kong? Is it the end of the Chinese government's power structure? It's not just extradition to China. It could be one of those two things as well. So they're kind of having a play on words there. He also goes into like a really funny story about the first like capital outflow, the first time that a government official kept their money outside of the country. So it's like the same bank that is kind of accused of this kind of thing. That bank was actually responsible for one of the first like safekeeping of assets in a foreign country for a top level government official. So yeah, there's a new guy there too. Let's see. Yeah, so this guy, he's got some good info. He mentions Kyle Bass's prediction for Hong Kong that happened in like April, I think. And sorry, I'm trying to find that screenshot. There it is. All right, so Kyle Bass's prediction about the Hong Kong dollar and the Chinese dollar, how they were a bit overvalued, and how he kind of anticipates a further drop in that currency's value. And that's about it. So I hope that was useful. Lots of cool information. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments.